Welcome to today's daily revision booster on natural selection and evolution. We're going to have a look at the industrial processes in chemistry, and then we're going to have a look at radiation in our physics prep. First up, we've got today's daily formula, which is the one for speed. So hopefully we know this one from maths anyway, but the speed in meters per second is your distance in meters divided by the time in seconds. In today's Biology Blast, we're going to have a look at the process of natural selection. We're going to look at evolution and the evidence for it. So hopefully we do know that evolution is the gradual change in a species over time. This isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that's going to take many years to actually occur. The way in which these organisms are actually going to evolve is through a process called natural selection. Now, this was something that was actually put forward by Charles Darwin most famously. Now, with natural selection, there are a few key stages you need to know about because they could very well ask you a 6-mark question on this, and all you need to do is explain each of these stages to max out your marks. So step 1 is variation, and that just means that within any given species, the organisms present within that will show variation. And as mutations occur, then the amount of variation will increase. The second stage is the bits referred to as survival of the fittest, which is basically just our way of saying in simple terms that those organisms which are best adapted to their environment are the ones that are going to survive. If they're not well adapted to that environment, then they die. The third step is the reproduction stage. So those ones that have been best adapted to survive are therefore more likely to get to the age where they reproduce. So what we then see is that leads into step 4, which is where the genes from the parents are being passed on to the offspring. So this means that the offspring are likely to have the same advantageous characteristics as their parents, because those are the organisms that have survived and therefore reproduced, therefore passing on those genes. The final stage is that this is repeated over and over again. As we've said, this doesn't happen overnight, but it happens over many years and many generations. So what we see is that process of the variation leading to survival of the fittest, which then leads to the reproduction and the passing on of those advantageous characteristics, takes place time and time again, and over that long period of time we can actually get a new species developing. The next thing we need to understand is the actual examples of natural selection, and there are 2 you need to know about. First ones are the peppered moths, and if you look at the top picture on the left, there are 2 moths in there. You've got a light coloured one on the right hand side of the image that you can just about make out, and a dark coloured one on the left which is really easy to see. And what we can see there is what it was basically like pre-19th century. Because the majority of peppered moths were light coloured because they camouflaged really well on the trees. What we then found was that any that were dark in colour and had that mutation for the dark colouring, then they were more likely to be eaten by the birds, hence why they were in a lower amount in the population. When the Industrial Revolution rolled around, then we had a whole load of soot and pollution in our environment, and the trees became covered in that soot. And it meant that actually at that point, those moths with the mutation for the dark colouring were better camouflaged than light colour ones, as you can see in the second picture. So that meant that the dark coloured moths became more common in the urban areas, and that can all be explained by the process of natural selection. Second example for you is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So what we actually find is, hopefully we remember, bacteria will evolve in a relatively short time because they've got a really rapid rate of reproduction. So when we get mutations occurring that make them resistant to an antibiotic, they get passed on to all of the offspring because they reproduce via binary fission, creating genetic copies. And that means that we can see in a quite short space of time the whole species becoming resistant to that antibiotic. The next thing we need to understand then is how we've actually got evidence for this process of evolution that we all relatively accept these days. And the key bit of evidence that you're most familiar with is bound to be fossils. Hopefully we know that fossils are formed when the remains of animals or plants get mineralized, which just means they're changed into rocks. And when we dig up fossils, then if they're found deeper underground, it just means that they are older. So if they're quite near the surface, younger fossils, deep underground, older fossils. And what we can actually do is have a look at those different layers that the fossils form, and we can put together a sequence showing how those organisms have changed very gradually over that long period of time. And when we've done that, that's what we mean by the fossil record. And that's one of those major pieces of evidence for evolution that means it's quite a widely accepted idea. If we actually go far enough back, then the oldest rocks that we find will contain fossilized bacteria. Whereas if we look at more recent rocks, then we've got the fossils of more complex organisms. So from those two bits of information, we can then put together the idea that actually all life on Earth evolved from bacteria, because those are the fossils we find in the oldest rocks, which then become more complex as time goes on and we get towards the more recent fossils. We also have the evidence from our fossil record that plant fossils occurred before animal fossils, so this tells us that plants were needed before the animals could evolve. One other key bit of information that we get from the fossils is that it also shows that closely related organisms have evolved from that same ancestor. So we can start to piece together these sort of family trees, if you like, of the organisms that have existed on our planet over the years. We don't just rely on the fossil record though, because some people will throw up problems with it in the fact that we do have gaps in the fossil record. So it's not a case of we can show every single organism that ever existed to show that perfect continuation. And some people say then obviously that's not right. But we do have other pieces of evidence we can use to support this. So things like the bacteria and the Atlantic tomcod, we can use those to study evolution because they've got really rapid reproduction rates. So that means that any of those mutations that occur are passed on quite quickly to the larger population. So we can see that reproduction rate being fast is very useful when we're studying evolution. The last way that we can get evidence for evolution is through the molecular comparison of DNA and proteins of the different organisms. And the reason we can now do this is because our technology has actually advanced quite a lot in science that allows us to carry out this comparison on the molecular level. And what we find when we do this is that any of the closely related species will have the most similar DNA and protein structures. So this means that from the analysis of the DNA and the proteins of those different organisms, we can piece together the ones that are most closely related and then build up a better family tree from that information. It is worth bearing in mind when we're talking about evolution that not all species will evolve. What we actually find is that if there's a species that's unable to adapt to the environment, then they will become extinct. And what we can actually do by looking at all of the information that we've gathered through all these different means, then we can say that 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth are now actually extinct. And unfortunately, due to the activities of us as the human race, then the number of species becoming extinct is still increasing, and at quite a scary rate. Quick reminder of today's daily formula, and it is the one for speed, which is measured in meters per second, and we work it out by doing the distance in meters divided by the time in seconds. Today's chemistry check is having a look at the industrial processes, and this is only for those folks who are doing the GCSE chemistry higher tier papers. So if you're doing combined science or foundation, then skip on to the physics section now. For those of you doing the GCSE chemistry higher tier, we're going to have a look at those three key processes: the Haber process, contact process, and the ones we use to make ethanol. So Haber process, first of all, hopefully the picture on the right is familiar to you. And this is how we're actually going to make ammonia. So we start off with two gases coming in, which was nitrogen and hydrogen. We then put those under pressure, and the pressure you need to remember is 200 atmospheres. That then travels on through into our actual reaction vessel, which is at a high temperature of 450 degrees Celsius, and there are these beds of the iron catalyst throughout that the gases are going to pass over. Now, what we find is, as a result of those conditions, then the nitrogen and hydrogen will join together to make ammonia. As it comes out of the bottom of the reaction vessel, then it passes through this cooling region, which means that the ammonia will condense to a liquid, and then we can just collect it off the bottom. Any of the unreacted hydrogen and nitrogen will get cycled back in so that we're not creating any waste there. One of the old favourite questions to do with the Haber process was using this graph here, which is actually giving you two different conditions and the effect on the yield. So remember, the yield is the amount of product that we're making, and what we've got on the x-axis is the pressure, and then the different colour lines are representing the different temperatures. So if they were to ask you at which conditions should we produce our ammonia for the highest yield, then what we'd actually be looking at is a temperature of 200 degrees Celsius and a pressure of 400 atmospheres in this case. So you might be asked to interpret that graph, and all you need to do to understand it is just take it one bit at a time. Pick out the pressure that meets the actual requirements of the question first of all, then look at the temperature and put those two together into your answer. One of the things we've looked at in one of our earlier daily boosters was having a look to see how we can actually change that yield by altering the reaction conditions. So when we're looking at this in terms of the Haber process, we're going to have a look at the temperature, the pressure, and why we recycle gases. Now, in terms of the temperature, what we actually find with this reaction, the forward reaction is exothermic, therefore the backwards reaction is endothermic. Hopefully we remember that if we increase the temperature, then it's going to move towards the left, decreasing the yield of ammonia, because it always moves in the direction of the endothermic reaction. So that tells us that lower temperatures will lead to a higher yield of ammonia. Whereas we do have a second factor we've got to consider, which is all tied into the work you did in C5 on rates of reaction. Hopefully we remember that the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of a reaction, because when we've got higher temperatures, the particles gain kinetic energy and therefore there are more frequent successful collisions. So what we actually do here is we're going with a compromise between a low temperature to get the higher yield, but a high temperature for a quick rate of reaction. Hence why we select 450 degrees Celsius. The second condition is the pressure. So if we look at our balanced symbol equation, then we can see we've got 4 moles of gas on the left and 2 moles of gas on the right. So hopefully we remember from our work on equilibrium position that if we increase the pressure, then the equilibrium position is going to move to the right because it goes to the direction of fewer moles of gas. So that means that higher pressures will lead to more ammonia being produced. However, we don't just increase the pressure up to 500 atmospheres, for example, because what we need to do is balance that whole idea of increasing the pressure to increase our yield without increasing the pressure to a point that the cost of designing the equipment and maintaining that high pressure become a little bit unobtainable. So what we're actually going to do is use 200 atmospheres because it gives a high yield without those extravagant costs and risks due to the high pressure environment. The last thing we just need to keep in mind with the Haber process is the fact that we recycle any of those unused nitrogen and hydrogen gases. Now, the reason we do that is just to reduce the costs. If we didn't recycle those gases, then what we'd find is we'd be wasting quite large amounts of the nitrogen and the hydrogen, because as we've established, only about 30% of those gases becomes ammonia as it goes through this process. So by actually condensing the ammonia, running that off, and then recycling the hydrogen and nitrogen that weren't reacted, then we're going to save ourselves money in the raw materials. The second industrial process we're going to have a look at is the contact process, which is the one we use to make sulfuric acid. So in order to carry this process out, we need 3 raw materials: sulfur, air, and water. The contact process itself is a 3-stage process. So stage 1 is where we're going to burn the sulfur in air to produce sulfur dioxide. So we start off with solid sulfur and oxygen gas, and we make sulfur dioxide SO2 gas. In stage 2, that sulfur dioxide we made in stage 1 reacts with oxygen to produce something called sulfur trioxide, which has the formula SO3. Now this is a reversible reaction, hence our little reversible reaction arrow, and therefore we need to select certain conditions. So the conditions we carry out stage 2 at are 2 atmospheres of pressure, 450 degrees Celsius, and a catalyst of vanadium oxide. Now when we use those conditions, this actually gives us a really high yield of about 96%. The third and final stage of our contact process then is where we take that sulfur trioxide and we convert it to sulfuric acid by adding water. So you've got your balanced symbol equation at the bottom again. H2O, we hopefully remember, is water. SO3 our sulfur trioxide, and then we make sulfuric acid, H2SO4. As we mentioned, stage 2 is a reversible reaction. So we've got those conditions that we've chosen. Now, again, you could be asked to justify this using your knowledge of equilibrium position. What we actually find is that in stage 2 then, the equilibrium position is already far to the right. So we don't need high pressures. And that's why we use 2 atmospheres, because that's just enough pressure to move the gases through the converter. If we consider the temperature that we're using, as we said, we use 450 degrees Celsius here. Now the forward reaction is exothermic, so that tells us the backwards reaction is endothermic. So we hopefully remember that a high equilibrium yield is then favoured by lower temperatures. But again, we're coming in with that compromise between the high yield and the high rate of reaction. So we use the 450 because it gives us a good yield and a high rate of reaction. One other point to bear in mind as to why we pick 450 is about the catalyst we're using. Because we're using vanadium oxide, that's only going to work if the temperature is above 380 degrees Celsius. So obviously we make sure the temperature exceeds that. The last thing to consider with the contact process is all about controlling the hazards. Now stage 3 itself, where we're making that sulfuric acid, is actually an incredibly exothermic reaction. So if we were to actually carry that out as a single step and just add our water, then we'd end up with an acid mist floating around the place. And hopefully everyone's got enough common sense to know that acidic mists are not a good thing to have floating around. So in order to reduce the risks here, what we actually do is we split that into a 2-step process. So the sulfur trioxide is passed through concentrated sulfuric acid first of all to make a chemical called oleum, and then the oleum is added to water to make large volume of the concentrated sulfuric acid. The whole idea behind that is that it then avoids that problem of the very exothermic reaction leading to an acidic mist. The third industrial process we need to know about is how we make ethanol, and there are 2 ways that we can do this. The first way is through a fermentation reaction. Hopefully we do remember that for fermentation we're going to use yeast, because yeast contain enzymes that convert glucose into carbon dioxide and ethanol. Now the glucose we're going to use is going to come from plants. Because it's coming from plants, that means that our raw materials are actually renewable, because as soon as we've actually used those plants, we can just grow some more. And that means that we've got a renewable process here. So we start off with our glucose and we make 2 products, the carbon dioxide and the ethanol. In terms of the conditions we actually need to use for this reaction, then the temperature is the key one. Because if the temperature is too low, then the yeast cells become inactive and the enzymes aren't going to convert enough glucose into the ethanol. If we have the temperature too high, then we're going to denature the enzymes, and that's going to happen if we increase the temperature above 50 degrees Celsius. So what we normally do is carry out fermentation at 35 degrees Celsius and at normal atmospheric pressure. The second way that we can make ethanol is by using non-renewable raw materials. And the problem with this is that these are the raw materials that are being used faster than they can be replaced. So they're eventually going to run out. And what we're actually doing to make ethanol is we're using the chemical ethene. And ethene comes from crude oil, which is a non-renewable raw material. Once we've got our ethene, then what we're actually going to do is carry out a hydration reaction to make the ethanol. So what we have is ethene plus water, which is in the form of steam, and then it will make ethanol in a reversible reaction again. So because this is a reversible reaction, we do need to consider the conditions, and for this to occur, we use 300 degrees Celsius as the temperature, 60 atmospheres of pressure, and a phosphoric acid catalyst. The last thing they could ask you to do with the two processes that we can make ethanol through is to actually compare them. Now, if you do get a comparison question, remember you've got to give the arguments for both processes. So you can't just say that I'd use fermentation because and then just list a few points about fermentation only. You need to talk about the comparison between fermentation and hydration. So in the little table, I've given you a quick summary about some of the key facts. So if we look at the cost of raw materials, fermentation has a low cost, better than the hydration, which has a high cost of raw materials. If we look at the conditions, fermentation is a moderate temperature and normal pressure, making that better than the hydration, which has high temperatures and high pressures required. If we link that into the energy requirements, fermentation is low, whereas the hydration has a high energy requirement, which will increase your costs. The rate of reaction, however, fermentation has a low rate of reaction, whereas hydration is high. So that's where hydration has an advantage over the fermentation. In terms of the percentage yield, then fermentation only makes about 15%, whereas the hydration is a much higher yield at 95%. And then finally, the purity of the product, then hydration has the higher purity because it has no byproducts, whereas fermentation has a low purity and we need to undergo the process of filtering and fractional distillation to just get the pure ethanol at the end. Quick reminder of today's daily formula: the speed in meters per second is the distance in meters divided by the time in seconds. Today's physics prep, what we're going to have a look at then is radiation. Now, hopefully we remember that most atoms are actually stable and therefore they don't undergo a process of decay. If we've got an atom that has an unstable nucleus, then they will undergo this process of decay and emit radiation as they do so. So any material that emits radiation is a radioactive material. You need to know about 4 types of radiation for your exam: alpha, beta, gamma, and neutron. So what we've got with our alpha, first of all, is it's a particle and it has the alpha symbol, as you can see, and it's actually the nucleus of a helium atom. So you can see the equation symbol on the right that you need to know. Beta is still a particle and that's actually a fast moving electron. Make sure you know the equation symbol on the right for your fast moving electron or beta particle. Gamma is an electromagnetic wave, so it doesn't have an equation symbol because it's just a wave of the electromagnetic spectrum. And then finally, a neutron is a particle, which hopefully we remember, and it's actually found in the nucleus of the atoms. Now, you've got your equation symbol on the right there for the neutron that you need to remember as well. 2 things that we need to remember on there are what the numbers represent. So the top number is the mass relative to a proton, and the bottom number is the charge on that particular item. One thing that we should remember at this point is that neutrons can undergo the process of decay to make a proton and an electron, as you can see in the diagram. When it comes to working out how much radiation is being given off by any particular item, then we use something called a Geiger-Müller tube or a Geiger counter. And what that actually does is we get these tiny clicks, and those clicks are actually tiny currents being produced when the radiation is ionizing atoms of the gas that's found within the tube itself. And obviously, if a lot of radiation is being emitted, then we'll have a lot of clicks, and therefore we know we've got a lot of radiation being given off. Hopefully this diagram is very familiar to you, because what this shows us is the penetrating ability of the alpha, beta and gamma radiation. Now you do need to know what can stop it, because they could ask you a question to identify certain types of radiation based on the penetrating ability. So alpha particles will be stopped by a few sheets of paper, your beta particles will be stopped by a few millimeters of aluminium, and those gamma rays are actually able to penetrate through pretty much anything other than a few centimeters lead or a few meters of concrete. But that doesn't stop all of it, some of it may still get through. The one thing to watch out for on this kind of question is if they've given you a table with different counts and one of them is completely stopped by paper, then we know that that is alpha. But if after it's passed through the paper the count has decreased slightly and then completely stopped by the aluminium, then that was a mixture of alpha and beta. It decreased slightly after the paper because the alpha was stopped, but the beta was still able to pass through the paper, only being stopped by the aluminium. So watch out for any where there's a slight drop with one, but not a complete stop with only the one source there, because it does mean that you've got a mixture. So as we've seen from that diagram then, alpha, beta and gamma have different penetrating powers. And what we actually find is that when we're talking about the radiation being emitted by a radioactive material, then it's called ionizing radiation. And just like those different types have got different penetrating powers, they've also got different ionizing powers. And what the ionizing radiation is going to do is remove electrons from atoms to produce these positively charged ions. And depending on which type of radiation we've got is going to tell us how easily it does this. To give you a quick summary of our alpha, beta and gamma then, you've got your little table here. So what we've got is the relative mass, the charge, the ionizing power and the range. So the alpha particles, for example, have a large mass, a charge of +2, they've got a short range, but a very high ionizing power. As we come to the beta, then you can see the ionizing power has dropped to only a medium and the range is medium. And by the time we're at gamma, then it's got a low ionizing power, but a long range. So you can just remember those patterns that as you go from alpha down to gamma, the ionizing power decreases, but the range increases. So the reason that we've got this is because those two are linked together. Because to ionize an atom, we've got to transfer energy to it. So the alpha particles transfer more energy to the material they travel through, and that means they don't have the energy to travel long ranges. Whereas because the gamma isn't really transferring the energy to those materials, then they will travel much further. The other aspect we need to consider where we're looking at radioactive decay are the nuclear equations. So what we find is for each type of decay, we've got a nuclear equation that we need to know. Now, what they could actually do with this is give you part of the equation and ask you to fill in the missing bits. And to be honest, it's a counting exercise. Because what we're going to find is that when you're looking at the numbers on the left and the total of the numbers on the right, then they add up to the same thing. So in our alpha decay, first of all, we know an alpha particle is emitted. We hopefully remember the alpha particle is a helium nucleus, which has the mass of 4 and the charge of 2. So what we end up with then is if we look at what we start with, then we've got a mass of 240. We subtract the 4 for our helium nucleus, and that gives us a mass of 236. We do the same thing with our charges. So we've got 94, and then we're going to take the 2 to give us 92. And you can look up what element that is on the periodic table because that's just the atomic number. In the process of beta decay then, a neutron is going to decay into a proton and an electron, as we said earlier. So what we start off with, in our example here, we've got carbon 14. So we've got obviously our mass of 14 and our charge of 6. Now, because we're having our neutron decay to a proton, those have the same mass. A neutron has a relative mass of 1, a proton has a relative mass of 1. So that means that we keep the same relative mass of 14. However, because we're changing our neutron into our proton, that means that our charge goes up by 1 to become 7 rather than 6. and then we add the symbol for our electron, which is our 0 and our -1, just to show that we're also giving off that fast moving electron. The third type of radiation we talked about were gamma rays. Now, because gamma rays are electromagnetic waves, they have no mass and no charge. So we see absolutely no change to the mass or the atomic number if all we're giving off is a gamma ray. The last type of decay we've mentioned is the neutron decay. Now, the decay of some nuclei actually leads to the production of large numbers of neutrons, and those neutrons then need to be emitted to make it stable once more. And a good example of this is helium-5. So you can see at the bottom we've got helium-5, and then that's undergoing the neutron decay, so we've got our neutron on the right there, and it will form helium-4, which is the more stable form. Hopefully at the end of today's Daily Booster you can talk about the theory of natural selection and evolution. For those of you doing GCSE chemistry higher tier, you can talk about the industrial processes and their different conditions. And then finally in the physics you can talk about the different types of radiation and the different nuclear equations associated with them.